This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome to this fascinating exploration of New Zealand's extraordinary birds. In a land where mammals were largely absent for millions of years, birds evolved to fill ecological niches you'd never expect. Today, we'll discover how the kiwi became a nocturnal brown forager much like a hedgehog, how the flightless takahe grazes like a deer, and why New Zealand's avian world turned conventional evolution upside down. Join us as we uncover the remarkable story of birds that learned to live like mammals. Chapter 1. Noah's Ark. Approximately 80 million years ago, a massive landmass began to tear away from the ancient supercontinent of Gondwana. This geological event, slow and inexorable, would set in motion one of the most remarkable evolutionary experiments ever witnessed on Earth. The splitting fragment carried with it a cargo of primordial life, plants and creatures that would drift into the southwestern Pacific Ocean and remain isolated from the rest of the world's continents for tens of millions of years. This drifting archipelago would become what we now know as New Zealand, or Aotearoa in the language of its indigenous people. The timing and completeness of this separation proved crucial. Unlike other landmasses that periodically reconnected through temporary land bridges during ice ages, New Zealand remained stubbornly, utterly separate. The waters between these islands and their nearest neighbor, Australia, never shrank enough to allow terrestrial mammals to cross. This wasn't just isolation, it was a quarantine that would last until humans finally arrived with their boats and their animals roughly 1,000 years ago. Biologists have given this geological arc a name that captures both its uniqueness and its most famous extinct inhabitant, Noah's Ark, a biological life raft carrying passengers on an evolutionary journey unlike any other.
To understand what makes New Zealand's fauna so extraordinary, we must first grasp what was missing. When you walk through a forest in North America or Europe, the rustling in the undergrowth might be a mouse, a badger, a deer, or perhaps a fox. The creatures that root through the soil for grubs, that browse on leaves, that dig burrows and claim territories, are overwhelmingly mammals. This has been true across most of the world for millions of years. But in New Zealand, before the arrival of humans, the only native land mammals were 3 species of bats. One of these bat species is now extinct, leaving just 2 remaining. There were no mice scurrying through the leaf litter, no deer browsing on vegetation, no badgers excavating burrows, no terrestrial predators hunting by scent in the darkness. This absence created something that ecologists call empty ecological niches. An ecological niche is not simply a physical space, though the metaphor of a niche as a recess in a wall captures part of the concept. More accurately, a niche represents a way of making a living, a particular role in the ecosystem that involves specific food sources, specific behaviors, specific adaptations. In most parts of the world, the niche of nocturnal insect eater rooting through soil is filled by creatures like hedgehogs, badgers, or various small mammals. The niche of large herbivore grazing on grasslands is occupied by deer, antelope, or cattle. These are mammalian niches because mammals evolved the adaptations to exploit them most effectively.
But ecological niches, in a sense, demand to be filled. Resources sit unused when no creature has evolved to exploit them. The evolutionary pressure is immense. Any organism that can adapt to use an unexploited resource gains an enormous advantage. In New Zealand's mammal-free environment, birds stepped into roles that would seem impossible to anyone familiar with typical avian ecology. They didn't just occupy these niches, they transformed themselves to become what Harvard zoologists called honorary mammals. Consider the kiwi, perhaps the most famous example of this extraordinary transformation.
When European naturalists first received a kiwi specimen in 1811, they thought it was a hoax on a par with the outlandish platypus, an impossible anatomical hodgepodge stitched together by a mischievous taxidermist. The reaction was understandable. This creature looked nothing like what anyone expected a bird to be. At first glance, a kiwi resembles a shaggy, pear-shaped ball with powerful legs and a long, probing beak. There are no visible wings. The feathers themselves lack the usual structure of bird feathers, appearing instead loose and hair-like. The kiwi had essentially become New Zealand's ecological equivalent to badgers, hedgehogs, and anteaters found elsewhere in the world, filling the niche of nocturnal burrowing insectivore. While the kiwi transformed into a nocturnal burrower, other New Zealand birds evolved to fill different mammalian roles. High in the alpine and subalpine regions of the South Island, the Takahe developed into something that resembles a grazing ungulate more than a typical bird. This large flightless rail became a specialized tussock grassland feeder.
In the forests, the kakapo, the world's only flightless parrot, evolved as a forest floor browser, filling a niche similar to that of herbivorous mammals that feed on low vegetation, fruits, and plant material. Like many New Zealand birds, it is nocturnal, and its slow metabolism and long lifespan evolved in an environment without mammalian predators. Before the moa's extinction, these enormous flightless birds occupied the niche of large browsing herbivores. Some moa species reached heights of 3.6 meters and weighed up to 230 kilograms. They functioned ecologically much like giraffes or large deer, browsing on high vegetation and processing large quantities of plant material through extended digestive systems. Smaller niches were filled by other specialized birds. Various species of flightless wrens, the only flightless songbirds in the world, occupied roles similar to those of small ground-dwelling mammals. The weka, a bold and inquisitive rail, became an opportunistic omnivore and scavenger. When Captain James Cook visited New Zealand in the late 18th century, he reported that the birdsong in native forests was so loud that he had to sail his ship far from land to hold a conversation on board. This cacophony represented a functioning ecosystem where birds filled virtually every available niche, from canopy to forest floor.
The energy economics of this transformation are revealing. Flight is one of the most metabolically expensive activities in the animal kingdom. It requires enormous caloric intake, massive muscle mass relative to body size, lightweight bones, and a highly efficient respiratory system. For a bird, maintaining the capacity for flight means investing tremendous resources in wings, flight muscles, and the physiological systems needed to power them. Evolution follows a strict principle. If a trait doesn't confer a survival advantage, it will eventually be selected against because it wastes energy. In New Zealand's predator-free environment, a bird that spent energy growing large wing muscles gained no advantage over a bird that directed that energy toward a larger digestive system, stronger legs, or larger egg production. Generation after generation, the birds that couldn't fly but were robust and energy efficient proved just as successful at survival and reproduction as their flying relatives. Over hundreds of thousands of years, the advantage shifted entirely toward flightlessness in many lineages. The energy saved by abandoning flight could be redirected toward other adaptations. This evolutionary experiment was possible only because of the complete absence of mammalian predators. On continents where mammals evolved and diversified, birds faced constant pressure from creatures that hunted by scent, that could pursue prey through dense vegetation, that could dig into burrows, that operated efficiently in darkness. For a bird on a continent to become flightless was essentially to become prey. The few flightless birds that do exist on continents, like ostriches and their relatives, are either large enough to defend themselves or fast enough to outrun most predators. But in New Zealand, there was nothing to run from. No foxes stalked the forest floor, no weasels raided burrows, no bears overturned logs in search of grubs. The birds of New Zealand essentially performed an evolutionary thought experiment. What happens when creatures designed for the air are given millions of years in an environment where the advantages of flight are minimal and the opportunities on the ground are vast? The answer transformed not just their bodies, but the entire structure of the ecosystem. Where other islands might have a few species of ground-dwelling birds, New Zealand developed an entire fauna of them. Where mammals typically dominated terrestrial niches, birds took over completely. Yet this remarkable adaptation carried within it the seeds of catastrophe. Every specialization is a trade-off. These birds had evolved perfect solutions to the challenges of their environment, but their environment was about to change in ways that millions of years of evolution had left them completely unprepared to face.
Chapter 2. Honorary Mammals. In the alpine grasslands of New Zealand's Murchison Mountains, where snow can blanket the landscape for months and winds howl across exposed ridges, a remarkable bird has perfected the art of grazing. The Takahe, standing half a meter tall with plumage that shimmers iridescent blue and green in the thin mountain light, grips a blade of snow tussock grass with one powerful foot. What happens next reveals just how far this bird has diverged from typical avian behavior and entered the realm of grazing mammals. The Takahe's beak, short but extraordinarily strong and glowing crimson red, clamps onto the tough grass blade. The bird applies pressure, up to 15 kilograms of force, pulling steadily until the outer sheath of the tussock tears away. This behavior, which researchers call tillering, is performed with surgical precision. The Takahe isn't interested in the fibrous outer layers that protect the grass from herbivores and harsh weather. Instead, it seeks the tender, pale inner core where nutrients concentrate. Watch a Takahe work through a stand of snow tussock and you witness something that looks less like a bird feeding and more like a selective grazer, choosing the choicest morsels from a pasture. The energy demands of this lifestyle are immense. Alpine grasses are low in nutrients and extraordinarily fibrous. To extract sufficient nutrition, a Takahe must feed almost continuously, spending up to 19 hours each day methodically stripping tussock blades and cropping sedges and rushes. The bird moves through its territory with purpose, returning again and again to productive feeding sites, creating pathways through the vegetation much as deer or sheep would. When the grasses produce seeds, the Takahe changes its technique, running its beak along the stems to strip the seeds with practiced efficiency. This seasonal shift in feeding strategy mirrors the opportunistic grazing patterns of ungulates that time their movements to exploit different plant resources as they become available. The consequences of this massive intake of fibrous material are as dramatic as they are unglamorous. A Takahe's digestive system cannot break down all the cellulose and fiber it consumes. Each day, an individual bird produces between 7 and 9 meters of droppings. These aren't scattered randomly across the landscape. Instead, Takahe deposit them in neat rows called latrines, territorial markers that serve the same function as the dung middens of rhinoceroses or the scent-marking piles of herbivorous mammals. These latrines communicate ownership and boundaries, reducing the need for direct confrontation between neighboring pairs. During the harshest winter conditions, when heavy snow buries the alpine tussock grasslands under deep drifts, Takahe demonstrate the behavioral flexibility that has allowed them to persist in this demanding environment. They move downslope into the beech forests, where snow cover is lighter and alternative food sources become accessible. Here they dig for the starchy rhizomes of thousand-leaved ferns and cutty grass, using their powerful beaks to excavate these underground storage organs. This seasonal migration between alpine grasslands and montane forests parallels the altitudinal movements of mountain-dwelling ungulates that shift their ranges to find forage as conditions change. The Takahe's territory size varies dramatically depending on habitat quality, ranging from just 5 hectares in prime tussock grassland to over 60 hectares in marginal areas. These territories are defended with fierce determination by breeding pairs that typically mate for life.
The aggression with which Takahe protect their grazing grounds would be familiar to anyone who has watched territorial herbivorous mammals. Intruders are first warned with loud guttural calls that echo across the valleys. If vocal threats fail to deter trespassers, physical confrontation follows, with powerful kicks delivered by legs built for both running and combat.
This lifestyle, so perfectly adapted to alpine grasslands, explains why Takahe subfossils have been found throughout New Zealand, from Northland in the far north to Stewart Island in the south. During the Pleistocene glacial periods, when ice sheets expanded and temperatures dropped, these tussock grasslands covered vast areas of both main islands. The vegetation that would later develop into dense forest was restricted to small, scattered refugia, while the open landscapes that Takahe specialized for stretched across extensive territories. Fossil evidence and pollen records confirm that between roughly 80,000 and 20,000 years ago, the landscape that would later become forested hillsides and valleys was instead dominated by tussock grasses, sedges, and scrubland. This was the Takahe's golden age, when birds specialized for grazing these grasses could thrive across a continent-sized range. While the Takahe claimed the alpine grasslands as its domain, a very different transformation was occurring in the lowland forests and shrublands. Here, in the leaf litter and soft soil beneath the canopy, the kiwi evolved into something that operates more like a badger or a particularly industrious rodent than a bird. The comparison becomes most striking when you observe a kiwi emerging from its burrow in the gathering dusk.
Unlike the Takahe, which feeds in daylight on visible vegetation, the kiwi inhabits a world of scent and touch. As darkness settles over the forest, a kiwi pushes its way out of its burrow, pauses to test the air, and begins its nightly hunt. The bird moves through the forest, tapping its beak against the ground with each step, probing repeatedly into the soil, testing, searching for the vibrations and scents that signal prey. The bird can literally sniff out food that lies hidden beneath the surface, driving its beak deep into the soil, sometimes penetrating 10 centimeters down. After each probe, the bird must sneeze sharply to clear the dirt from its nostrils, a sound that becomes familiar to anyone who spends time in kiwi habitat after dark. The whiskers at the base of its beak help it navigate through dense vegetation in near total darkness. When a kiwi encounters one of New Zealand's giant native earthworms, the ensuing struggle reveals just how far these birds have departed from typical avian feeding behavior. Some of these worms grow to extraordinary sizes, matching a garden hose in both diameter and length. They are powerful creatures, muscular and deeply anchored in their burrows. When a kiwi gets a grip on one with its beak, a tug of war begins that can last for several minutes. The bird cannot simply yank the worm free. Such force would tear the prey in half, and the kiwi would lose half its meal. Instead, it applies steady, patient strain, waiting for the worm's grip on the soil to weaken. The worm resists with all its considerable strength, sometimes producing enough force that it escapes back into its burrow. But an experienced kiwi knows to maintain constant pressure without jerking, essentially exhausting the prey through persistence.
Some species of these giant worms possess another remarkable quality. They phosphoresce when disturbed or exposed to air. As a kiwi slowly pulls one of these glowing worms from the soil, the bird's face becomes illuminated with an eerie, ghostly light. Researchers who have witnessed this phenomenon describe it as one of the most surreal sights in New Zealand's forests. A bird's head glowing in the darkness as it wrestles with its luminescent prey. The kiwi's use of burrows demonstrates the mammalian character of these birds. Most birds, even ground-nesting species, don't dig burrows. Yet kiwis create extensive burrow systems, digging networks of tunnels and chambers that serve as daytime retreats. These burrows protect the birds from aerial predators and provide stable microclimates during temperature extremes. A kiwi territory might contain multiple burrows, and the bird rotates between them, spending a few days in one before moving to another. This pattern of burrow use and maintenance is characteristic of mammalian ecology, not avian behavior.
The territorial behavior of kiwis reinforces their mammalian resemblance. Depending on species and habitat quality, a kiwi pair might defend anywhere from less than 2 hectares to over 40 hectares. These territories are proclaimed through loud calls that echo through the forest, the male's shrill ascending whistle answered by the female's hoarser tone. These duets serve to announce ownership and warn rivals to stay clear. If a strange kiwi ignores these vocal warnings and enters occupied territory, the ensuing fight bears no resemblance to the ritualized displays typical of most birds. Instead, kiwis engage in vicious combat, using high jumps and slashing attacks with their powerful clawed feet. The kicks can be devastating, and fights sometimes end with one bird dead or mortally wounded. This willingness to fight to the death over territory is more characteristic of mammalian predators defending hunting grounds than of typical avian behavior. When kiwi chicks hatch, they emerge fully feathered and completely independent, receiving no parental care whatsoever from the moment they break free of the egg. This is extraordinarily unusual among birds, where even precocial species that can walk and feed themselves shortly after hatching typically remain with parents for some period. A kiwi chick must fend for itself immediately, foraging alone in the forest while navigating all the challenges that its parents face. In the dense forests, yet another bird evolved a lifestyle that seems impossibly strange for a parrot. The kakapo, massive and moss-green, spends its nights browsing on forest floor vegetation like a small herbivorous mammal. At up to 4 kilograms in weight, this is the world's heaviest parrot, and it has abandoned both flight and the typical parrot lifestyle of feeding in the canopy. Instead, it walks through the forest on powerful legs, cropping ferns, browsing on low vegetation, and harvesting fallen fruits. The kakapo's beak, while recognizably that of a parrot with its hooked shape, functions more like the cropping mouthparts of a herbivorous mammal. The bird uses it to precisely bite off leaves, to strip bark, and to process tough plant material. When rimu trees undergo a masting event, producing enormous quantities of fruit, kakapo gorge themselves on the bounty. They can climb the trees to reach fresh fruit, but their method of returning to the ground reveals their flightless nature. Rather than flying down, kakapo spread their wings and glide, often badly misjudging distances and tumbling the last few meters to the forest floor. For a bird that spends most of its time on the ground, these crash landings seem to cause little concern. The kakapo's reproductive strategy reflects its evolution in a mammal-free environment. The bird has evolved a slow metabolism and an extraordinarily long lifespan, with some individuals confirmed to be over 90 years old. Breeding is tied entirely to the irregular masting cycles of native trees, particularly rimu. These trees don't produce fruit every year. Instead, they undergo masting events triggered by specific weather patterns, sometimes waiting 4 or 5 years between major fruiting episodes. When a mast does occur, it floods the forest with nutrition, and kakapo respond by breeding intensively. Females can raise multiple chicks during these abundant years. But this strategy only makes sense in an environment where the risks of death are minimal and birds can afford to wait patiently for optimal breeding conditions. While Takahe, kiwi, and kakapo represent the most dramatic examples of birds filling mammalian niches, they were far from alone. The weka, another flightless rail, evolved into an opportunistic omnivore and scavenger that operates much like a small fox or raccoon. Bold and inquisitive to the point of being problematic for humans, weka have been known to steal food from campsites, snatch keys from hikers' hands, hop into cars through open doors, and make off with anything bright and shiny that catches their attention. They can run fast enough to outpace a human in short bursts, and jump surprisingly high when motivated by the prospect of food. Before human arrival, weka would have filled the niche of a small, opportunistic ground-dwelling predator and scavenger, the sort of role that foxes, raccoons, or small cats occupy in other ecosystems.
The extinct flightless wrens of New Zealand represent perhaps the most astonishing convergence with mammalian forms. These were the only truly flightless songbirds ever known to exist, and there were 3 distinct species. Small and mouse-like, they would have scurried through the leaf litter and dense undergrowth, much like shrews or small rodents. The bush wren, the rock wren, and the Lyle's wren each specialized in different microhabitats, partitioning the ground-dwelling insectivore niche in ways that paralleled how different rodent species divide up similar resources. 2 species of adsbills, large flightless relatives of rails, once stalked through New Zealand's forests. These birds stood nearly a meter tall and possessed powerful, heavy beaks that they likely used to dig for prey and process tough food items. Their exact ecological role remains somewhat mysterious because they became extinct before European naturalists could study their behavior. But their anatomy suggests they filled a niche similar to that of ground-dwelling omnivores or perhaps specialized predators on large invertebrates. The now extinct moa occupied the niche of large browsing herbivores. The largest moa species would have browsed on vegetation at heights that put them in competition with no other herbivores, while smaller species grazed in grasslands or browsed on shrubs. The extent of this evolutionary experiment becomes clear when you consider that New Zealand developed not just 1 or 2 birds filling mammalian roles, but entire guilds of them. There were nocturnal insectivores like the kiwi, diurnal grazers like the takahe, forest floor browsers like the kakapo, omnivorous scavengers like the weka, small insectivores like the wrens, large browsers like the moa, and predators on large invertebrates like the adsbills. In a typical continental ecosystem, every one of these roles would be filled by mammals, but in New Zealand, birds claimed them all. These adaptations required millions of years to develop and refine. The kiwi's olfactory system didn't appear overnight. The takahe's powerful beak and grazing behavior emerged through countless generations of selection for birds that could most efficiently extract nutrition from tough alpine grasses. The kakapo's synchronization with masting cycles represented a deep coevolution between bird and forest. Each of these species became exquisitely tuned to its particular way of life, optimizing every aspect of its anatomy and behavior for its chosen niche. They became, in their specialized ways, perfect solutions to the challenge of making a living in their respective habitats. But perfection in one environment can become profound vulnerability when that environment changes. What happens when birds that have spent millions of years evolving to fill mammalian niches suddenly encounter actual mammals?
Chapter 3. The Price of Perfection. When you pick up the skeleton of a typical bird, what strikes you first is how impossibly light it feels. The bones seem almost hollow, because they are. This is the fundamental architecture of flight. Every gram saved from the skeleton allows for more muscle mass to power the wings, or more distance traveled on the same amount of fuel. A bird's skeleton represents millions of years of refinement toward weight reduction and efficiency in the air. Now pick up a kiwi skeleton, and everything you think you know about bird anatomy gets turned on its head. The bones are heavy, solid, dense with marrow, like those of a mammal. There's nothing delicate or air-filled about them. This isn't unusual or surprising once you understand what happened. It's the logical endpoint of committing entirely to terrestrial life. But it reveals something crucial about the nature of evolutionary adaptation. Every solution is also a limitation. Flight demands lightweight construction, but it also constrains how large and heavy a bird can become. The physics are unforgiving. Past a certain body mass, powered flight becomes impossible, regardless of how much muscle you can pack on. But once a lineage abandons flight, these constraints evaporate. Heavy bones become an advantage, providing structural support for powerful leg muscles, enabling greater body mass, serving as mineral reservoirs that hollow bones cannot match. The kiwi that maintained expensive, air-filled bones gained nothing, while the kiwi that redirected that biological investment into heavier, more functional bones thrived.
The same logic governed every transformation that turned New Zealand's birds into mammalian equivalents. Wings atrophied to vestigial stumps because maintaining them consumed energy better spent elsewhere. Enhanced senses of smell and hearing compensated for reduced vision because locating prey underground or navigating in darkness required different sensory tools than flight. Powerful legs replaced flight muscles because running, digging, and fighting provided more survival value than aerial mobility in an environment without mammalian competitors. Each adaptation represented an optimization refined over millions of years. Natural selection is relentless in eliminating waste. A kiwi that invested precious calories in maintaining functional wings but never used them would produce fewer offspring than a kiwi that converted that energy into eggs or fat reserves for winter. Generation after generation, the more thoroughly terrestrial birds outcompeted those that hedged their bets by retaining partial flight capabilities. The result was not birds that couldn't quite fly. It was birds so perfectly adapted to ground dwelling that flight became not just unused, but anatomically impossible. The Takahe's transformation into an alpine grazer followed the same inexorable logic. A powerful beak capable of stripping tough tussock grasses provided such an advantage in extracting nutrition from fibrous vegetation that any bird with a weaker beak left fewer descendants. The investment in jaw muscles, robust skull structure, and the neural control needed for precise tillering paid enormous dividends in an environment where those plants formed the primary food source. The birds that could process this difficult food source most efficiently claimed the best territories and raised the most chicks. For the kakapo, freeze in place became the optimal anti-predator response because the only predators that existed hunted visually from above. Against an aerial hunter like the now extinct Haast's eagle, remaining motionless among vegetation worked perfectly. The bird that ran when threatened drew attention through movement and could be tracked easily from the air. The bird that froze became nearly invisible against the forest floor. This behavioral pattern, reinforced over countless generations, became so deeply ingrained that it operated automatically, requiring no conscious decision. But every one of these optimizations rested on a foundation that remained invisible precisely because it was so constant: the complete absence of terrestrial mammals. This wasn't simply an environmental feature like temperature or rainfall that birds adapted to work around. It was the fundamental assumption underlying their entire evolutionary trajectory. The absence of mammalian predators didn't just allow flightlessness, it made flightlessness advantageous. It didn't just permit strong scent, it made scent irrelevant to survival. It didn't just enable freeze responses, it made freezing the best available defense. When environmental assumptions hold steady for millions of years, they cease to be assumptions at all. They become laws of nature as reliable as gravity. No kiwi could evolve to anticipate the future arrival of stoats because natural selection operates only on current conditions. The kiwi that somehow maintained wariness of creatures that didn't exist would waste energy on pointless vigilance and leave fewer offspring than the kiwi that moved confidently through its environment, focused entirely on finding food and mates.
The problem with optimization is that it works. It produces organisms exquisitely fitted to their circumstances, so finely tuned that they can exploit resources and occupy niches that less specialized creatures cannot access. But this very success creates brittleness. A specialist has invested everything in doing one thing superbly well, often at the cost of flexibility. The kiwi became such an effective nocturnal burrowing insectivore that it could no longer be anything else. The Takahe became such an efficient alpine grazer that it required alpine tussock grasslands to survive. The kakapo became so perfectly adapted to a predator-free forest that it developed responses that would prove suicidal when predators appeared. Nor could these transformations be easily reversed once conditions changed. Evolution rarely runs backward. Once wings have atrophied to functionless stumps, once flight muscles have disappeared, once bones have filled with marrow, the path back to aerial life becomes blocked by the sheer magnitude of changes required. A flightless bird facing new selective pressures favoring flight would most likely go extinct before it could re-evolve functional wings. The fossil record is full of such evolutionary dead ends, lineages so specialized that they could not adapt when their world shifted.
The behavioral and sensory adaptations carried the same irreversibility. Once a lineage commits to hunting primarily by scent, developing the keen vision of aerial hunters would require wholesale reorganization of the brain and sensory organs. Once freeze in place becomes the automatic response to threat, replacing it with active fleeing or fighting would demand generations of selection against deeply ingrained neural pathways. These are not simple traits controlled by genes that can flip quickly under new pressures. They represent complex adaptations involving anatomy, physiology, neurology, and behavioral patterns that have become embedded in the very structure of how these birds interact with their world. The kiwi's enhanced sense of smell, evolved to locate worms underground, provided no warning of an approaching stoat that also hunted by scent. The bird's well-developed olfactory capabilities, which gave it such an advantage in finding prey, offered no protection against a predator using the same sense to track its scent. In fact, the kiwi's strong musky odor, irrelevant in an environment where predators hunted by sight, became a beacon once scent-hunting mammals arrived.
The Takahe's brilliant plumage evolved in an environment where coloration mattered only for communication between birds, made perfect sense when threats came from above, and could be evaded by simply walking into vegetation. But against ground-level predators that hunted by scent and sound, the bird's visibility became irrelevant to its survival, while its scent and loud territorial calls advertised its location. The powerful legs built for running and fighting other Takahe proved inadequate against introduced deer that competed for the same food sources more efficiently, or against predators that struck with teeth rather than engaging in ritualized combat. The kakapo's freeze response, so effective against the predators that shaped its evolution, rendered it motionless when a stoat followed its scent trail. The bird that had survived for millions of years by remaining still now sat unmoving as a predator approached, following not visual cues but the trail of scent molecules the bird constantly emitted. Against such a hunter, freezing meant simply making the predator's job easier. This is the price of perfection. To become supremely good at one thing requires abandoning the capacity to do many other things. To adapt completely to one set of conditions means becoming unable to tolerate different conditions. The birds of New Zealand had transformed themselves into creatures so well suited to their mammal-free world that they became unable to survive in any other kind of world. They had evolved the right answer to the wrong question, or more precisely, to a question that would soon change in ways that made their answer catastrophically incorrect.
Specialists thrive when their specialization matches their environment, but face extinction when that environment shifts. A generalist species, one that maintains multiple options and retains flexibility, can often weather dramatic environmental changes. But these birds had become the opposite of generalists. They had bet everything on conditions remaining stable, and for 80 million years that bet paid off spectacularly. The diversity of flightless birds in New Zealand, the success with which they filled every available niche, demonstrated the power of their strategy. But evolution cannot hedge against unknown future contingencies. Natural selection optimizes for the present, not for hypothetical scenarios that might never occur. The birds that might have maintained some capacity for flight, some wariness of non-existent threats, some flexibility in their responses, were outcompeted by birds that invested everything in being the best possible version of what their current environment rewarded. And then the environment changed. When terrestrial mammals finally arrived in New Zealand after 80 million years of absence, they encountered an ecosystem of specialists trapped by their own success. Birds perfectly adapted to a world without mammals, possessing no defenses against creatures that hunted by scent, dug into burrows, pursued prey through darkness, and moved with the speed and silence evolved in millions of years of competition with other mammals. The collision between these exquisitely adapted birds and the predators whose absence had allowed their adaptations would prove devastating beyond anything the islands had experienced in their entire geological history.
Chapter 4. The Mammalian Invasion. Approximately 1,000 years ago, the first humans arrived in New Zealand. They came in voyaging canoes from Polynesia, navigating by stars and currents across vast stretches of the Pacific Ocean. These seafaring people, who would become known as Maori, brought with them the plants and animals necessary for establishing settlements in a new land. Among their cargo were two creatures that would prove catastrophic for New Zealand's unique birds: the Polynesian rat, called kiore, and the kuri, a dog. For the first time in 80 million years, terrestrial mammals that hunted by scent had arrived in these islands. The impact was swift and devastating. Within a few centuries of human arrival, the moa, those giant browsing birds that had functioned as New Zealand's equivalent to giraffes and deer, were extinct. All 9 species vanished, erased through a combination of hunting by humans and predation by the introduced rats and dogs on their eggs and chicks. The Hast's eagle, which had preyed on moa, disappeared with them. At least a dozen other bird species followed them into extinction during this first wave of mammalian invasion. The ecosystem that had developed over millions of years was being dismantled in mere centuries.
But this was only the beginning. When European settlers arrived in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, they brought with them an entire menagerie of mammalian predators. Ship rats, larger and more aggressive than the Polynesian rat. Norway rats, even bigger still. And then, in what must rank among the most disastrous conservation decisions ever made, deliberate introductions of stoats, weasels, and ferrets, brought to New Zealand starting in 1879 with the explicit purpose of controlling rabbit populations that were destroying sheep pasture. The rabbits were themselves an introduced pest, of course, but the solution proved far worse than the problem. The stoat, in particular, emerged as the deadliest enemy that New Zealand's ground-dwelling birds had ever faced. Small, sinuous, and relentlessly efficient, stoats are specialized predators on small mammals in their native European and Asian ranges. They possess several qualities that make them perfectly suited to hunting New Zealand's flightless birds. They can squeeze through tiny openings. They climb with agility. They hunt primarily by scent. They are active both day and night, and they kill with precision, targeting the back of the neck or the base of the skull. A stoat weighs only about 250 grams, but it routinely kills prey much larger than itself through sheer ferocity and technique. For kiwi chicks, stoats represent an existential threat. At birth, these chicks weigh only about 300 grams, small enough that a stoat can kill them easily. Research has shown that in areas without active predator control, only about 5% of kiwi chicks survive their first 6 months. Stoats account for approximately half of all kiwi chick deaths on the mainland. The young birds remain vulnerable until they reach about 1 kilogram in weight, at which point they can usually defend themselves. But this takes 40 weeks, more than 9 months, during which every night brings the risk of encountering a hunting stoat. Adult kiwis have few effective defenses against mammalian predators. An adult can fight when cornered, delivering powerful kicks with its clawed feet, and these kicks can sometimes fend off a cat or even a small dog. But against a determined stoat or a large dog, the kiwi has little chance. Dogs, in particular, kill adult kiwis with horrifying frequency. A dog doesn't need to be aggressive or trained to hunt. Even a friendly, playful dog can kill a kiwi simply by grabbing it, shaking it, or giving it what the dog considers a playful push. The crushing injuries are almost always fatal.
In Northland, where dog attacks on kiwis have been particularly severe, the average life expectancy of adult brown kiwis has fallen to just 14 years, roughly half what it should be in the absence of dog predation. Consider what this means for a species whose females don't begin breeding until they are 3 to 5 years old and who might only produce a handful of chicks over their lifetime, even under ideal conditions. When adult mortality increases dramatically due to dog attacks, the population mathematics become grim. Without intensive intervention, local populations spiral toward extinction.
The Takahe faced multiple threats when mammals arrived. Vulnerable to the same introduced predators affecting other ground-dwelling birds, Takahe also confronted a different kind of challenge: competition from red deer. These large herbivores, like Takahe, specialize in grazing and browsing on alpine vegetation. But deer are mammals with millions of years of evolutionary refinement in competitive grazing systems. They are larger than Takahe, more mobile, and they reproduce faster. Where Takahe and deer share habitat, the deer consume the same native grasses that Takahe depend on, particularly the nutritious inner cores of snow tussock. The heavy trampling by deer hooves damages tussock plants and compact soil, degrading the very habitat that Takahe require. The deer's feeding is less selective than the Takahe's careful tillering. They crop vegetation more heavily, reducing its quality and quantity for the birds. Against stoats, adult Takahe fare better than smaller birds. Their size makes them formidable opponents for predators that specialize in smaller prey. But Takahe eggs and chicks remain vulnerable, and the combination of predation and habitat degradation proved devastating.
By the time Europeans began documenting New Zealand's wildlife systematically in the 19th century, Takahe had already become rare. The last confirmed sighting occurred in 1898, and ornithologists declared the species extinct. For 50 years, the Takahe existed only in museum specimens and historical records, a casualty of the mammalian invasion like so many other native species. Then, in 1948, a remarkable discovery electrified the conservation world. Dr. Geoffrey Orbell, searching in the remote Murchison Mountains of Fiordland, found a small population of Takahe still clinging to survival in one of the most isolated and rugged parts of New Zealand. The location was no coincidence. The Murchison Mountains form a peninsula jutting into Lake Te Anau, with water on 3 sides and treacherous terrain on the 4th. This extreme isolation had protected the Takahe not by providing better habitat, but simply by keeping most mammalian predators away. Even there, the population was precarious. Deer had reached even these remote valleys, competing for food. Stoats, capable of traveling across water gaps and climbing through the most difficult terrain, posed a constant threat to eggs and chicks. The surviving Takahe occupied only a fraction of their former range, restricted to the small area where conditions happened to allow their survival.
The kakapo population collapsed even more dramatically. By the time Europeans began seriously studying these birds in the 20th century, they survived only in the most remote parts of Fiordland and on Stewart Island, areas where stoat populations were lower or where terrain provided some protection. The combination of introduced predators and habitat modification had reduced what was once a widespread species to scattered remnant populations clinging to survival in isolated pockets. The extinction of Lyell's wren, documented with unusual precision, shows how quickly these specialized birds could be erased once mammals found them. In 1894, a lighthouse keeper named David Lyell arrived at Stevens Island in Cook Strait to tend the newly constructed lighthouse. Lyell had a cat named Tibbles. The island was small, and Tibbles apparently had an excellent hunting instinct. Within the cat's first year on the island, it brought its owner a succession of small mouse-like birds, species that the island's new human inhabitants had never seen before. The lighthouse keeper preserved some of these specimens and sent them to ornithologists on the mainland, who recognized them as a new species of flightless wren. By the time the scientific description was published, Tibbles and possibly other cats that had subsequently arrived on the island had killed every single Lyell's wren. The interval between scientific discovery and extinction, less than 1 year.
By the mid-20th century, the scale of the disaster was becoming clear. Of the approximately 27 species of terrestrial and freshwater birds known from quaternary fossil records in New Zealand, all had either gone extinct prior to European settlement or were in severe decline. The kakapo population had crashed to fewer than 200 individuals. Various kiwi species were disappearing from vast areas of their former range. The Takahe, seemingly extinct for 50 years, survived in only one small, isolated pocket of habitat. Countless other native birds, while not flightless, were also declining as introduced predators wreaked havoc across the entire ecosystem. The response from conservationists and government agencies gradually coalesced around a recognition that saving these species would require something unprecedented: creating spaces where introduced mammals could not reach. Offshore islands became critical refuges. New Zealand is surrounded by hundreds of small islands, many of which are isolated enough that swimming mammals cannot reach them. Some islands had never been reached by rats or other predators. Others had been invaded but could be cleared through intensive eradication programs.
Kapiti Island, lying off the coast north of Wellington, became one of the first major island sanctuaries. At about 1,965 hectares, it was large enough to support substantial populations of multiple species, but small enough that eradication of introduced predators was feasible. Beginning in the 1980s, conservationists worked to eliminate all introduced mammals from the island. The last stoats were removed by the mid-1980s, and by the 1990s, the island was essentially predator-free. Little spotted kiwi, which had been reduced to a single small population on another island, were translocated to Kapiti. The population thrived, growing from just a handful of founders to over 1,200 individuals. Today, Kapiti Island hosts one of the most important populations of little spotted kiwi in existence. Little Barrier Island, or Hauturu, became another crucial sanctuary. At 3,083 hectares, this island was declared a nature reserve in 1894, making it one of the oldest formally protected areas in New Zealand. Eradication of introduced predators took longer, with cats being removed by 1980 and Polynesian rats finally eliminated by 2004. The island now supports several rare and endangered bird species, including substantial kiwi populations. The birds here live in an environment that approximates what all of New Zealand once offered: abundant food, suitable habitat, and freedom from mammalian predators.
But offshore islands, while critical, could only provide limited space. New Zealand's rarest birds needed more habitat than a few small islands could offer. This recognition led to increasingly ambitious projects to create predator-free areas on the mainland. Zealandia, a 225-hectare sanctuary in the heart of Wellington, represents one of the most successful of these mainland sanctuaries. Protected by a predator exclusion fence completed in 1999, the sanctuary has been cleared of all introduced mammals. The fence, 8.6 kilometers long and specially designed to prevent climbing by any mammal, creates an island of safety in the middle of urban New Zealand. Inside Zealandia, species that had vanished from the Wellington region have been reintroduced and now breed successfully. Takahe waddle through the grasslands, feeding on exotic pasture grasses supplemented by native vegetation. Little spotted kiwi forage in the forest at night, their populations growing steadily year by year. Other rare birds, including saddlebacks, stitchbirds, and tuatara, the ancient reptile that is New Zealand's last surviving link to the age of dinosaurs, all thrive within the fence. The sanctuary demonstrates that with sufficient commitment and resources, mainland areas can be made safe for species that evolved without mammalian predators.
The most ambitious conservation program for kiwi, called Operation Nest Egg, addresses the fundamental problem that kiwi chicks are most vulnerable. The program's logic is straightforward. If chicks can be protected until they reach a size where they can defend themselves against stoats, their survival rate increases dramatically. Conservation workers locate kiwi nests in the wild and carefully remove eggs before they hatch. These eggs are incubated artificially, and the resulting chicks raised in predator-free enclosures, either on offshore islands or at specialized facilities. When the young birds reach about 1 kilogram in weight, they are returned to their area of origin, large enough now to survive in the wild despite the presence of predators. This program has proven remarkably effective. In areas where Operation Nest Egg operates alongside predator control, kiwi chick survival rates can reach 50 to 60%, compared to the 5% typical in unmanaged areas. The difference is literally the difference between population growth and population collapse. For a species that reproduces slowly and requires years to reach breeding age, improving chick survival rates, even modestly, can reverse decades of decline.
Similar intensive management has been applied to kakapo. Every surviving individual is tracked and managed. The birds live on predator-free islands where conservationists supplement their diet during poor fruiting years to ensure females can breed successfully. Each nest is monitored, and eggs are sometimes removed for artificial incubation if natural incubation appears to be failing. Chicks are weighed and examined regularly, and sick individuals receive veterinary treatment. The level of intervention is extraordinary, a consequence of how perilously close the species came to extinction. From a low of just 51 known individuals in 1995, intensive management has grown the population to over 200 birds today. It remains critically endangered, but at least the trajectory is now toward recovery rather than extinction. Yet even these successes reveal the profound challenge. Saving these species requires constant, expensive, intensive intervention. Predator control programs must be maintained year after year because stoats, rats, and other introduced mammals breed prolifically and will quickly recolonize any area where control lapses. Fences must be inspected and maintained. Island sanctuaries must be monitored to ensure that no rats have reached them by swimming or rafting on debris. Each generation of kiwi chicks requires protection. The financial and labor costs are substantial, sustainable only through a combination of government funding, volunteer efforts, and public support.
New Zealand has set itself a staggeringly ambitious goal: predator-free 2050. The objective is to eliminate rats, stoats, and possums from the entire country by the year 2050. If achieved, this would represent the largest conservation project ever attempted, eradicating mammals from islands totaling 268,000 square kilometers. The technical and logistical challenges are immense. Methods that work on small islands don't scale easily to the mainland. Public acceptance is required for control methods that many find controversial. The costs run into billions of dollars. Conservation efforts have pulled multiple species back from the brink and established growing populations in protected areas. The trajectory for many of these birds has shifted from decline toward recovery. But whether current efforts can expand from islands and fenced sanctuaries to create a predator-free New Zealand remains the defining question for the next quarter century. The answer will determine whether birds that spent millions of years evolving to fill mammalian niches can survive in a world now permanently inhabited by actual mammals.
New Zealand's flightless birds represent one of evolution's boldest experiments. What happens when creatures designed for the sky inherit the earth? For 80 million years, these birds answered that question spectacularly, transforming themselves into honorary mammals that grazed grasslands, burrowed through forest floors, and browsed on vegetation. Their success revealed both the power and peril of specialization. Perfectly adapted to a world without terrestrial mammals, they became exquisitely vulnerable when that world changed. Today, we're attempting something equally unprecedented: protecting specialized birds in a world fundamentally altered by the mammals they never evolved to face. The outcome remains uncertain. Whether through fenced sanctuaries or the ambitious goal of eliminating predators from an entire nation, we're asking if human intervention can compensate for millions of years of evolutionary misalignment. New Zealand's birds remind us that evolution creates masterpieces of adaptation, but never guarantees survival. Sometimes the most perfect solution becomes tomorrow's fatal vulnerability. Thank you for listening.